Chapter 8. Ireland, mid-morning. Mr. Phelps's private jet took off. It would be a short flight. He gently fingered the stitches above his right brow and gave a half smile. Phelps was a man, not a gentleman, although he was scrupulously attired as such in a dark navy-tailored suit and silk tie. With his slim physique, hair waxed back and cleanly shaven, his determined step smacked of Whitehall, his stomping ground. Since his hubristic days, he'd willingly joined the secret society of the Titans. He'd needed order, method, and the opportunity to express his particular psychosis. Their ancient society had been the only fit. Now he was in as deep as it was possible to go. He'd been forced to make a pact with the devil years before, which had imprisoned his soul. Through those bars he could still see his daughter. He'd been informed he could keep her. It was a goodwill gesture for his unwavering allegiance. Then, as he knew it must, he'd received the kill order for Rika. All evidence of Rika ever having existed was to be destroyed. Phelps's wife's name had been included for assassination almost as an afterthought. She was deemed too much of a liability in case she exhibited any emotion to Rika being permanently removed. Rika had been the sole cause of her death. In hindsight, Baxter had done him an enormous favour in preventing him from killing Rika. Phelps hadn't been able to account for why he'd deliberately disobeyed the order. He'd told Rika to run, and if anyone ever suspected he was still alive, he'd hunt him down and kill him. He knew Rika had believed him. Mr. Phelps had accepted his time in jail as a necessary ploy to prevent any further scrutiny of the situation. He'd had time to consider his tenuous position within the Titan organization and had come to realize sparing Rika's life had given him a bargaining chip should he ever need it. When there'd been no ill-advised and futile attempt on his life, he'd understood the message. He was still expected to serve. Rika had disappeared without trace. Phelps had taken an educated guess. Either the boy had been discovered and disposed of, or maybe he was still alive. He'd had plenty of time to consider the consequences of that point. He'd done the maths which totalled to his quick or protracted death, depending on how much information the Titans needed. In all honesty, he couldn't tell them very much. Even he didn't know which of the 12 was the boy's parent. He'd never spent a single thought on a pointless effort. He knew with certainty he would never be groomed for succession. Still, it was enough for him to be of service when a more hands-on approach was required. That was definitely in his DNA. Becoming serious, he pulled out a new pack of cards. Happy Families. These were used as a whimsical treat for a kill order when the recipient could take their time and have some fun. Removing the cellophane, he knew from experience they'd all depict the same image. Running the pack across the tabletop, he selected one. It depicted Mr. Dreadnought as the loose cannon. Phelps's muscles hardened under his clothes. He was in a heightened state of excitement as he stared at the caricature. Oh, happy day. He retained the card of Dreadnought, placing it in his inside jacket pocket. His jet touched down at Dublin Airport. They'd fallen from a clear sunlit morning through the grey clouds that lay dense and saturated seconds above. He wasn't drawn to look out of the portal window. Instead, his manner was all business, with a cool air of detachment. His steward stood in readiness at the hatch door as the plane slowed to a halt. No words were spoken. As soon as his highly polished brogues touched the tarmac, the boarding ramp was drawn up, the hatch locked, and the jet moved off, departing from the runway. Now he'd found himself in Ireland with a single purpose. Although a thoroughly practiced and skilled killer, he had been thwarted by Baxter more than once. His failure had stuck in his gullet like an obstructive fishbone needling for attention. He'd dissected the whole event of their last physical skirmish blow by blow and could not escape the conclusion he'd allowed him to gain the upper hand by, and he'd had to swallow hard for this one, underestimating Baxter's furor. He wouldn't allow it to happen again. It had been a wake-up call that his privileged life had made him both sloppy in mind and body. He'd always kept in shape, but this particular excursion would require, more importantly, time for him to physically heal and mentally prepare. Therefore, he'd taken his first leave of absence in over 15 years. His superiors hadn't been pleased. They hadn't shown it in either word or deed, but he knew. Any change in routine by their subordinates was treated with deep suspicion. Phelps drove south, just him and a modest hold-all on the passenger seat. He'd arrived in the early morning at Treve, a small village where he'd stopped at the local post office to collect his parcel. He'd noticed how the postmistress had looked at him with a tight smile. Wary people, he understood. Heading back out, the sun almost blinded him as it bounced off the rain-soaked roads. He'd put his foot down as his SUV ate up the miles of empty roads that weaved between lush green hills, giving way to a forest landscape in the distance. His glass bottles had chinked merrily in their parcel. After several arduous weeks of mixed martial arts and physical training, his tattered clothes hung off him and his body was riddled with bruising and cuts synonymous with self-harm. Phelps needed to test his newly honed fighting body. He'd heard on the underground grapevine of an illegal cage fight that was held out at sea on a private tanker off the coast of Somalia. Many of the men that fought there were ex-military, proficient killers who'd considered their lives expendable. They'd gather from every war-torn country to fight bare-knuckle for money. There were no rules. Biting and gouging and the use of weapons were openly encouraged. Those that didn't survive were thrown overboard for the sharks. He'd find a worthy opponent there. £50,000 would gain him access to the most skilled of them. He'd be the last man standing. After, he would return to civilization. Dreadnought, and then Baxter. Just the thought of him caused his pupils to dilate.